All that celebrations are magnificent, at the heart of the pageantry is a simple message.
Everything inside the palace started to fall apart the instant it attempted to act as though nothing was wrong. Despite all of that, the festivities are amazing. A straightforward message is the core of the pageantry. No public admission, no notification, and no announcement. Even the most seasoned royal insiders could see the sudden transformation that occurred behind those spotless palace doors. A transfer of electricity meant to be undetectable. However, since this was never intended to occur in this manner, everyone was able to do it in some way. Charles remained king. The crown remained stationary. No one had taken the throne, but decision-making, power, and control were no longer operating in the same manner. As soon as William entered the room and witnessed the truth being expressed through silence rather than words, he realized this. It wasn't just fatigue. It was more than just health. It would have been simpler to control, embrace, and explain it. The revelation that Charles had been functioning inside a system that was no longer fully committed to him stunned the entire globe. A mechanism that controlled, altered, and filtered the data provided to the monarch. And everything had to change when that fact became apparent. William wanted to move on, but he was unable to do so. Something inside the palace had already begun to move without authorization, so he moved forward. As though the shift had started long before Charles openly accepted it, meetings had already been set up in his name, briefings had already been redirected, and decisions had already been taken. There was a royal shuffle as a result. The realization that the shift had been taking place in the background was more significant than the change itself. Furthermore, William's departure from Clarence House entailed more than just new responsibilities. He wasn't sure, because the most important question was not what would happen if someone was able to disturb the power structure, change the king's schedule, and stifle medical warnings without being discovered right away. It was the length of time it had been occurring. Catherine noticed it right away. The weight, not the specifics or the records. William's silence, his inability to respond, and his hesitation to take a seat said more than any explanation could, because it wasn't easy to make this change. This was a forced acceleration of destiny brought on by a pervasive systemic failure rather than the product of free will. In addition, the repercussions spread more quickly than anyone had anticipated. When the meeting took place, Camilla was unaware of it. Then she sensed it in the silence, in the abrupt loss of control, in the knowledge that a decision had been made without her presence, without her influence, and without her power to affect it. That's when the real stress started, because William's newly acquired power did more than only keep Charles safe. Everyone's place was redefined around him. The most alarming aspect was how everything changed in silence, including timetables, access, and decision-making. There was a clear and continuous transfer of power from one core to another, but neither a significant event nor a public proclamation took place. The first people to notice were the workers. Suddenly, William's office was receiving copies of messages that had previously needed to be approved by Charles's circle. As the unwritten understanding spread swiftly, meetings that had been held in one direction were now being held in another. There was no longer a single authority. It was falling apart. Uncertainty also grew inside that split, because each modification brought up a fresh query. How far would William go if he could intervene to save the system? How much had Charles already given up if he had consented to this change? Why did it feel so permanent if it was only temporary? The solutions took some time to appear. Rather, they showed themselves via choices and acts that, although first unimportant, had greater significance. Chains of command were reduced, priorities were rewritten, appearances were changed, and William was moving more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Not holding back, not waiting, and not running away. That aspect was impossible to overlook. This was no longer preparing. Control was what this was. And the palace started to crumble the more William took on that role. Not formally, not in public, but subtly, emotionally, in ways that would never be expressed out loud, but would be felt in every subsequent decision. Because authority doesn't end in the middle once it begins. Until something compels it to, it keeps going. And something was beginning to take shape inside the palace in preparation for it. the kind of tightness that, while initially silent, eventually suffocates everything around it, causing people to take sides without ever voicing their opinions. Because every choice William made became a signal once he shifted from support to control, every signal also had repercussions that could not be ignored. Charles sensed it right away, not as a public humiliation or a loss of status, but as something far more intimate, the unsaid knowledge that the system designed to support him had already started to change for someone else. He was no longer obliged to maintain his speed during meetings. He no longer had complete control over schedules. Every adjustment felt like a deduction, despite the fact that every action was described as defensive. This move was therefore extremely risky. Charles was gradually undermined rather than eliminated. William was fully aware of the beauty of that line, because going too far would look ambitious. Too little would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. He had to think that his actions were reasonable, essential, and inevitable, and he changed because of that pressure. A person who is already influencing the present, not just an heir planning for the future. Because she could see things that others could not, Catherine kept close and observed everything, knowing more than she ever said. This authority wasn't the only issue. It has to do with controlling the story. Where did they appear? For the crown, who spoke? When stability itself was beginning to erode, who stood for stability? The moment that drastically altered the tone then arrived. What should have been a popular option wasn't. Charles was supposed to make a major appearance, but it was rescheduled in a discreet, official, and unrestrained manner. And when William assumed that position, the public's perception was permanently altered. It didn't feel like a substitute for the first time. It was similar to succession. The outer world started to catch up with what the palace had previously experienced at that point. It wasn't necessary for the headlines to convey everything. The story was conveyed through the pictures. William stood where Charles should have. Beside him, Catherine seemed calm and relaxed, already bearing the burden of something greater than the current situation. All of this was driven by an awareness that gained traction more quickly than any formal declaration. This was no longer a transitory phase. This was the change. Instead of lectures or headlines, Camilla experienced the impact through access. Previously unquestionably open doors now needed verification. Her household used to make all the decisions, but all of a sudden William's organization came first. Additionally, the message was rather obvious. Influence was being funneled, even if it wasn't stated explicitly. Furthermore, once influence has been lost, it is difficult to regain. That's what made things more tense, because Camilla didn't openly criticize the change. She wasn't overtly opposed to it. However, the quiet itself was significant. The lack of response turned into a reaction in and of itself. Everyone in the palace was keeping a close eye on William's every move, but they were also keeping a close eye on that stillness. Charles, meantime, encountered a situation that was even more difficult: acceptance. It is a matter of reality rather than a sign of weakness or defeat, the need to share the crown's power in order to protect it. Adjustment was necessary for that survival, and yet, in conditions no one had anticipated, the future he had always knew would arrive sooner than anticipated. Furthermore, it didn't feel like a surrender when Charles decided to codify that change in some way. Since everything would have been destroyed if things had remained as they were, it felt like preservation. As a result, rather than growing dramatically or abruptly, William's authority developed steadily and without doubt. Greater oversight, involvement, and presence in previously Charles-only sectors. With every step, the palace's equilibrium shifted until the question that no one wanted to ask was unavoidable. How long would it take William to take the initiative if he was already doing so in practice? There was no need to answer that query, because the solution was beginning to emerge. It was through deeds that shouted louder than anything the palace could formally confirm, not via declarations or speeches. A parent who takes a slight but not total step back. Unofficially, a son was making progress, and the system was reacting quickly to a development that it could no longer postpone. Charles was still in charge. In actuality, though, William was already in charge. Inside those magnificent walls, everyone knew one thing. Power never entirely reappears after it reaches this threshold.